Welcome and greetings, everyone. My name is Joyellen Williams, and I am the curator of the Bentley Rare Book Museum at Kennesaw State University. I would like to officially welcome you to Unbound, Researching Records of Enslavement, an event co-sponsored by the Rare Book School, Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship for Diversity, Inclusion, and Cultural Heritage. I am here with my dear colleague and mentor, Dr. Barbara McCaskill, Professor of English at the University of Georgia. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a poetry reading in honor of the enslaved people and voices we'll be hearing today through archives. I hope this poetry reading centers our hearts and minds and positions us for a great discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and read two poems, both by Langston Hughes, one of my favorite writers. The first poem is called American Heartbreak, and I am reading from the collected poems of Langston Hughes. American Heartbreak. I am the American heartbreak, rock on which freedom stumps its toe. The great mistake that Jamestown made long ago. Okay, and let's see, I'll advance this slide. Okay, and then the next poem, just so you can see, that I'm going to be reading is called Negro, also by Langston Hughes. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. I've been a slave. Caesar told me to keep his doorsteps clean. I brushed the boots of Washington. I've been a worker. Under my hand, the pyramids arose. I made mortar for the Woolworth building. I've been a singer, all the way from Africa to Georgia. I carried my sorrow songs. I made ragtime. I've been a victim. The Belgians cut off my hands in the Congo. They lynch me still in Mississippi. I am a Negro, black as the night is black, black like the depths of my Africa. Thank you so much for that moment. I think this is an appropriate time to provide a sensitivity note and a harmful content warning for today's program. Enslavement in any form is an emotionally difficult concept for most people. In our discussion of American enslavement and the archives documenting this period in history, we will encounter words and phrases that are offensive and unacceptable today. We will also see stories of individuals whose circumstances may evoke sadness or anger within us. We use these stories to better understand the past, and we believe that by presenting rather than censoring history, we are contributing to a more informed, just, and empathetic historical record. So wanted to go ahead and say that. Dr. McCaskill and I wanted to make sure that everyone was ready for what we were going to be talking about today. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. So you'll see an introduction slide, and I've got some questions that are informing today's presentation. We've got, why should we even discuss enslavement history? Because some people do wonder that today. How can we find and interpret evidence of enslaved people in unbound forms of print culture like newspapers and correspondence? And then what makes this research difficult, and how do we overcome these difficulties? Many researchers would agree that archives documenting the institution of slavery in America can be difficult to locate, confusing to interpret, and emotionally uncomfortable to work with. Today's program considers these obstacles and offers suggestions for researching and interpreting enslavement records in a new light. First, I will begin the program with a presentation about 18th century newspapers that document enslavement in the U.S. colonies. Then Dr. McCaskill will discuss her experience interpreting the stories of enslaved people in the 19th century. At the conclusion of this presentation, we will offer a bibliography of resources for further learning, which will appear as a link underneath this video. We hope this program sensitizes your eyes and ears to the voices of enslaved people, even, even when their voices were systematically silenced. So, as I mentioned, I will start us off with a discussion of enslavement archives we have here at Kennesaw State University and the methods I've developed to effectively and compassionately facilitate access to these records. Here at Kennesaw State, our rare book room stewards roughly 200 historic newspapers that were printed during the 18th century, mostly the late 18th century. Most of these newspapers were purchased or from antiquarian book dealers or by local or purchased from local collectors. The Bentley Museum originally acquired many of these newspapers for their documentation of events during the American Revolutionary War. But that is not all they contain. Many of these newspapers include advertisements for enslaved laborers and for people in other forms of forced labor. The right side of this slide shows some examples. So we see here on this part, this top ad, it says a good price will be given for a Negro slave, man or boy. We see in the middle, to be sold, a middle-aged Negro woman. Here, closer to the left side, $2 reward for an enslaved person. So it is estimated that 200,000 of these kinds of advertisements appeared in U.S. newspapers between 1730 and 1865. I am a woman of African descent whose ancestors on both sides of my family were enslaved. So viewing these records makes me feel grieved, angry, emotionally raw, but also curious. Likewise, students and researchers here at Kennesaw State have mixed reactions to these records. I remember bringing a few of these newspapers to an African American literature class many years ago when I had just started my career at KSU. The students in the class, most of whom were African American, were aghast and in disbelief upon looking at these archives. Yes, they'd learned about slavery in school, but it's different seeing the primary sources. Most students dealt with negative feelings, disgust, or even helplessness because they did not know how to process this information. Others desperately wanted to know what happened to people featured in these advertisements, and they expected me to have the answers, but I didn't. After seeing the same situation play out a few times, I realized something wasn't working. Though my intentions were good in placing these materials before students and prompting discussion, I started to feel like I was shocking them at best and at worst, traumatizing them. Either way, they weren't learning much about how to interpret these records. Fast forward several years, and I've learned a different way to teach information literacy with enslavement records, a way that centralizes the Black experience, highlights Black resistance and agency in the face of enslavement, and encourages a slower analysis of these materials. So I'll now take you through my process that's going to include the challenges and then also some solutions that I have. So challenge number one, I found would be reading difficulties. One of the first challenges that researchers may face when interpreting newspapers related to enslavement is that the newspapers themselves can literally be difficult to read, often due to paper deterioration, loss of ink in some spots, or previous repairs. Additionally, the print is much smaller and denser than modern day newspapers, especially for people who are used to reading newspapers online. There are also not many headlines. There are very few illustrations, and photography hadn't been invented yet, so there are no photographs. So the left side of this slide shows an example. This collection item is from the Connecticut Current, September 10th, 1782. And as you can see, page 2 and 3 shows a very visible tape repair that someone made. And then also you might see here some staining, which is known as foxing, which is caused by chemical reactions in paper because of how paper would have might have been made during that time. Okay. One of my favorites, these newspapers also tend to have obsolete typefaces that can really confuse researchers. The biggest culprit is the long S, which is a letter form we no longer use. Many people, and as you can see, I've pointed it out here, many people confuse it with the letter F. You can see in this example that the word cash is using the long S. So to 21st century readers, it makes the word look like it's C-A-F-H instead of C-A-S-H. But you can see here underneath the word rags in the next line is using the short S, which is what we're used to. And so there were rules about when the long S and short S were used in words, but it can be difficult for researchers to get used to seeing those variations of letter forms. Even if they do know it, it can still slow down reading. My solution to this challenge is to legitimately slow down and use some tools. In the 18th century, newspapers were a critical mode of communication. There wasn't radio and television, and people in the past heavily read these newspapers, and hence they're going to have tears, repairs, and staining. That's normal. Researchers should prepare to spend quite a bit of time with these newspapers to account for all these types of reading challenges. And even though many of them are bifolium texts, meaning that they only have 2 leaves and 4 pages, again, they contain a lot of text, so they're very jam-packed. So you need to take your time with reading these and leave extra time. They're going to require close reading. I suggest using a jeweler's loupe, which is labeled at the top here, or a magnifying glass to enlarge the text for ease of reading. Some of the sight issues can also be mitigated if the collections are digitized or if an archivist may be able to digitize it for you so that you can enlarge the text through, online or through a software like that. It also helps to use a portable light, like this clip light pictured here on the right. And while you do not want to expose the newspaper to unabated UV light, minimal usage of a clip light to illuminate the text should be fine. Lastly, I recommend using an archival spatula here at the bottom. And it can help you to turn the pages, especially when newspapers have been folded a lot and they're vulnerable at the crease. The spatula can help maintain some control when turning pages. And I've also learned it can serve as a reading guide, so you can literally just go line by line with your spatula, and it helps you keep your eyes where they're supposed to be so you don't get lost into a sea of text. The next challenge I've noticed is, and I mentioned this earlier, is that in addition to the basic difficulties of reading these newspapers, they can be emotionally exhausting to process. In these papers, it is common to find, of course, humans for sale among very mundane things like wine, horses, raisins, tea, and horses. This is troubling to a 21st century reader who is normally more sensitized to the idea of human trafficking. So being mentally prepared is important. Here are some examples I found that are difficult. Like here at the top, the Connecticut Current and Weekly Intelligencer that we have from July 18th, 1780. It says that to be sold for hard money only, Negro boy, about 15 years of age. It goes on to say what we can do. And then it says also a secondhand chase is as being sold with him, as if a human and a used carriage are of the same worth and should be, bundled together as a bargain. It's nearly unbelievable to my ears today. And then this below here, at the bottom of the slide, this is an advertisement from the Independent Gazetteer, the Chronicle of Freedom, October 8th, 1782. It contains an advertisement for a Negro wench who's supposed to be sold. And this wording can be very, very hard to read. Even though wench may not have carried the exact same pejorative meaning that it does now, it still feels derogatory and can be really triggering for people, especially Black women. So there's no easy solution to this, but I do suggest taking time to mentally prepare and process what you are reading and what you're learning about. You'll notice I offered a harmful content statement at the beginning of our program. If you're an individual researcher working independently, this may not be as critical. However, when you do present your work, even in an informal setting, I highly recommend offering a content warning. Help people mentally prepare for what they might see or read. This helps mitigate a little bit of the shock and gives people a chance to ready themselves for difficult content. And then when you're actually doing the hard work of reading through these records, there's not an easy solution to emotional exhaustion. I would say take your time and take frequent breaks. It is hard to spend several hours at a time reading about how humans sold, abused, victimized, and oppressed other humans. Make time to discuss your research with a trusted colleague or friend. At least in my experience, it's really helped to verbally process these difficult topics with someone that I trusted or someone who was maybe doing similar work. So that's what I can offer for that very, very difficult challenge. Challenge number 3, I've broken it into 2 parts because they're related, but they're all related to context. This is one that's very important. Few people can dive into archival research without consulting supporting sources. This is especially important when we're dealing with records from hundreds of years ago. We don't live in 18th century America, and even though we may have learned about this time period or the Revolutionary War in grade school and higher education through independent research, we still don't know exactly what it was like to live then. We must acknowledge that the way people thought, spoke, and behaved in the late 18th century were all informed by their own set of cultural norms and the resources that were available to them. We're no longer accustomed to these cultural norms in the 21st century, and we're often in danger of making 21st century assumptions about 18th century people. So let's use an example from the Connecticut Current again. Both of these are from the Connecticut Current, and we see several ads for clean rags and cash offered for them. It can be easy for a 21st century reader to be confused by this advertisement or perhaps make their own assumptions about why a printing office or a paper mill would pay for rags. Maybe they wanted rags for cleaning or perhaps for cheap clothing. It's hard for a researcher to know without some background information. So, how can we combat blind spots in our knowledge? I suggest conducting preliminary research using supporting secondary sources. If you went to elementary school in the United States, you probably did learn about the American Revolutionary War or the time period, late 18th century. But unless you refresh yourself on this topic or you're in it all the time, it might be hard to remember the historic context of the period. When did monumental events happen during the war? Which colonies existed? How did people get information? What kinds of materials were available to the average person? So again, I suggest doing some studying. Some of this research can be done pretty easily using digital resources by organizations like History.com, the National Archives and Records Administration, in the Library of Congress. You may be able to find some ready-made timelines or fact sheets on the internet about this time period or monumental events. I highly suggest going further and checking out books from your local library and reviewing articles in scholarly databases if you have access to them. For example, let's say you checked out a book or article that addresses paper production in the 18th century. That would inform you that paper from this time period was actually made from linen rags. So that might explain why at the advertisements we looked at on the previous slide, we're offering cash for clean cotton and linen rags. But again, if you're not already familiar with that, it would have taken some secondary research to be able to figure that out. Okay. I also suggest exploring books, articles, and media that provide information about American enslavement specifically. And today we are going to, again, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to offer a great bibliography which will provide reference sources about late 18th century America. And again, a link to this bibliography can be found in the video description from this webinar underneath the video once it's posted. So as you can imagine, doing some of this research does take time. Most people want to dive right into the primary sources, but please take some time with secondary sources first. You'll be less likely to make assumptions about things you see in primary sources, and you'll also be less confused when you encounter something unfamiliar. This is the second part to this challenge number 3, which is geography and scope, which is related to historical context. Most of the newspapers that we have in the rare book room from the late 18th century were printed in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, mostly in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, some in New York. And so these states are, they're geographically farther from Georgia, which is where Kennesaw State University is located. So some local researchers just may not be as familiar with these cities or with the areas described in the papers. And to add another layer of complication, here in the Rare Book Museum, we don't have full runs of these newspapers. We have, select issues. So you can't necessarily just see all of the Connecticut Current from a specific time period or whatnot. So I would say when you're doing research, keep location in mind. It's very, very important because enslavement laws were enforced differently by colonies, and these changed over time. So I'll give an example here. Okay. All right. So this is an example that I really, really like. This is from the Independent Gazetteer from 17, let's see, let me make sure it's the right one. Okay, yes. The Independent Gazetteer from 1782. And it actually is describing an enslaved man named Fortune who has run away. And I find this interesting because I won't read the entire thing, but basically it describes this man named Fortune and says that he ran away and he has procured a pass or is passing right now as a free African American person, and he is even maybe taken on a new identity. And they said that he's probably secured a pass from or secured an identity of a man named John. So he's taken something a new identity, and he is living his life as a free African American. And I think that context is really interesting here because in 1780, Pennsylvania passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery, which did stop the importation of enslaved people to the colony, and required all enslaved people to be registered, and it granted freedom to all people that were born after 1780, and it became a model for abolition in many, many northern states. But here, Fortune it says he's 25 years old. And he ran away in May 1781. Again, changed his name, secured a pass as a free African American. So let's just think for a second. Fortune's 25. So, and he's 25 in, 1781, 1782. So clearly born before the 1780 Act was passed. So that means he does remain enslaved by the Pennsylvania law. But with that legislation in mind, we see a major act of resistance from Fortune. He's not content to wait for the gradual abolition, quote unquote, of slavery that he could only hope would affect his life in the future. He's choosing to risk his life and take his freedom by using another identity. This tells us that Fortune is desperate to be free and clever enough to successfully assume a new identity in support of his freedom. We can also tell that he's succeeding in his escape because this advertisement is appearing or still appearing over a year after Fortune ran away, which shows that his enslaver is having major trouble tracking him down. So anyway, I find that really interesting. But again, mentioning location, what if someone wants to, see all the times that Fortune's advertisement was mentioned between 1781 and 1782? Unfortunately, our collections can't necessarily give that because we have select issues. However, perhaps it would be good for the researcher to, maybe seek out a library database or a microfilm collection, for example, that is housed at a library or a newspaper database. Many of these resources are available through university libraries and public libraries so that you don't have to pay. But this is something, again, to keep in mind, to know, okay, if I'm looking at a specific location, what should I be looking for? What should I be keeping in mind? Just make sure you have awareness of that. And now for the final challenge, interpreting descriptions. This is a big challenge that I would like to address because most 18th century American newspapers were published by and for free white people. And many of the advertisements of enslaved people were written by or on behalf of white enslavers. So we don't have, direct quotes from enslaved people asking for their perspectives in these advertisements. Instead, we hear enslavers describe the physical attributes of enslaved people and make judgments on their character. And many times, and that we also hear them disparage enslaved people. This happens quite frequently. So it may feel as though enslaved people are silent in these records, but they are not. We, as researchers, just have to listen better. So let's take a look at here on the left side, this example from the Independent Gazetteer, October 8th, 1782. Page 3 contains an advertisement for a runaway enslaved person named Primus. And I'll read most of it, probably all of it actually. It says, $16 reward, a Negro lad named Primus, about 18 years old, a sullen, down-looking, infamous rogue, has had 6 masters and has a small hole on the lower part of his left cheek resembling a shot hole. He is short and high-shouldered, had on an old linsey jacket, flax shirt, and tow trousers. His skin, it is supposed, must be very torn by making his escape from a person who had him in custody through a greenbrier swamp. He has a mother living with the widow Kennedy at the Yellow Springs on Lancaster Road and will attempt to get to her. Whoever takes up the said Negro and delivers or causes to be delivered to his master, the subscriber, on said farm, or to Mr. James Thompson at the Conestoga Wagon in Market Street, will receive the above reward. So the writer's physical and moral descriptions of Primus portray him as problematic, unappealing, and insubordinate. But what if we were to listen less to the advertisement writer and more to Primus? What do we hear? Perhaps we can hear that Primus is determined in his resistance. He refuses to remain enslaved and is tenacious in his attempts to get to his mother. Let's talk about another nuance. It's also important to note that not every advertisement for a human being in the late 18th century is referring to an enslaved person of African descent. It can be easy to make that assumption upon reading the advertisements. Researchers should remember that enslavement, indentured servitude, and apprenticeships were all forms of labor in the 18th century, and they could look different depending on the situation. So this is an example here that I really like because it challenged me a bit. This is from the Independent Gazetteer in December 1782. And I won't read the whole thing, just the first part. But it says, £3 rewards, ran away on Sunday morning, the 8th instant, which means the 8th day of the month, an apprentice lad named Isaac Hazelton or Ashelman, about 18 years of age, 5 feet 7 or 8 inches high, black hair, very swarthy complexion, sullen look, etc., etc. For the longest time, I assumed Isaac was a person of African descent. I eventually realized that I actually do not fully know. We have this description, which we know could be biased or inaccurate, but it's what we have. So, and in it, Isaac is described as having black hair and a swarthy complexion. And that's where my assumptions began. I hear black hair, and then swarthy usually means dark complexion. And I automatically think of a black person or a person of African descent. but this advertisement could be describing a person of mixed race or perhaps a European person with darker complexion, because during the 18th century, swarthy skin could mean brown, olive colored, or heavily tanned or sunburnt skin. So, some ads are clearer than others. Some will literally describe a person as a Negro, a slave. Some of them will say mulatto on them. Others won't be as specific. So we may not always be able to determine the exact situation a person was in or how they would have chosen to identify themselves. We often don't know at all. But it is important to maintain awareness that different forms of forced labor existed and different types of people were subject to these realities. And so my solution is, really to be aware of this different types of terminology. I mean, even in this presentation alone, we've seen different descriptions of color, different ways to describe women, ways to describe prices and like forms of money. We've seen like dollars, pounds, pence, pistoles, all sorts of things. So it can be hard to keep up with all of this. I recommend that researchers use a resource such as the Oxford English Dictionary to assist with this research. Often it's called the OED. It will help you understand how a word might have been used in the 18th century and whether it had multiple meanings. The OED requires a subscription to access all of it, but many libraries do subscribe to it. So that's my final piece of advice. And this marks the end of my portion of the presentation. And I will now introduce you to Dr. Barbara McCaskill, who is Professor of English at the University of Georgia and Associate Academic Director of the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts, where she teaches and writes about African American literature and culture. Her books include the monograph, Love, Liberation, and Escaping Slavery, William and Ellen Craft in Cultural Memory, published in 2015. Her co-edited volumes include Postbellum Pre-Harlem, African American Literature and Culture, 1877 to 1919, published in 2006. And The Magnificent Peter Thomas Stanford, Transatlantic Activist and Raceman, published in 2020, which was issued also in paperback in 2024. Her edited collection of chapters with Caroline Gebhard, African American Literature in Transition, 1818 to 1900, is forthcoming in 2026 for the 17th volume Cambridge University Press series. With Sarah Ruffing Robbins and Mona Narayan, she is also co-editing The Lives, Writings, and Legacies of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, under contract with Edinburgh University Press. She serves as co-organizer for the multi-year, multi-institutional grant, Culture and Community at the Penn Center National Historic Landmark District, funded by the Mellon Foundation. Dr. McCaskill, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, Joy Ellen, and so thrilled to be working with you. Happy to see you, delighted to see you in your role as a curator. You are a proud and accomplished alumna of the University of Georgia, where I work. Before I get started, I do want to make one correction to the biography, and it was my error. And that is the book that I have co-edited with Caroline Gebhard, African American Literature in Transition, 1880 to 1900, is coming out in 2025.
Okay, great.
I don't want to prolong that project any more than it's already been prolonged. We're really excited about that project. It's part of a 17-volume series edited by Joycelyn Moody and Cassie Smith, coming out from Cambridge University Press, that tells the entire story of African American literature from the 18th century to now.
Amazing.
So please, you can already purchase some volumes of that series online. Please check that series out. And so I am very happy to be here, thanks to the Rare Book School. I'd also like to thank Kennesaw State University and the Mellon Foundation, which has sponsored this very educational webinar. I am going to pick up with some ideas that Joy Ellen has shared. I'm very pleased that Joy Ellen talked about the resilience, the tenacity, the resistance, and the agency of African Americans that we see in these 18th century runaway ads when we take the time and bring the context to interpret them. And I'm going to pick up with those themes by talking about more closely some of the questions that we ask and some of the ideas that we bring to the interpretation of 19th century periodical literature in which we find so many stories of enslaved African Americans. I want to first begin by pushing back against an assumption that I had as a longtime student of African American literature, and that my own students often come into the classroom with. And that assumption is that the stories, particularly the firsthand accounts of African Americans who escaped enslavement in the 18th and 19th centuries, are few and far between. I know now where that assumption comes from. That assumption comes from our focus on the Bound book, on separately published books as sources of these stories. I want to reform that understanding and say to all of you watching today that there is a capacious, abundant archive of firsthand stories of enslaved African Americans if we, following Joy Ellen's nudge, look beyond the obvious, and particularly if we focus on literature that are not books. There is an abundance of stories of African Americans, some of them coming to us secondhand by non-Black people, but often coming firsthand from Black people themselves who have escaped slavery, talking after the fact about their tenacity, their resistance, their agency, and their determination to be free. I owe that understanding to a plethora of scholars on whose shoulders I stand, some of whom are mentioned in the bibliography that we include at the end of this discussion. I like to name those whom I have relied upon again and again for wonderful ideas, the people that I have worked with and the scholars that I have studied who have put forward this idea of the capacity of African American literature in the 18th and 19th centuries and the capacity of Black periodical literature are Eric Gardner, Francis Smith Foster, Benjamin Fagan, William Andrews, John Ernest, Robert Levine, and many, many more. I'm going to precede my discussion of specific examples of these kinds of firsthand accounts with some context about just what early African American literature looks like. And if you will please advance the slide, I'm just going to begin. I want to first call attention to the fact that I'll be drawing most of the examples that I share today from the stories of two formerly enslaved African Americans. The first is Ellen Craft, who escaped from slavery in Macon, Georgia in 1848 with her husband, William Craft. You see here Ellen depicted in the frontispiece of the book that she and Ellen published in 1861 in England, documenting their experiences. She was a very fair-skinned African-American woman, so she audaciously and boldly escaped slavery, disguised as an affluent white male planter who had several ailments and was seeking to go to Philadelphia, which was then the center of the American medical universe, to get treatment. The other person from whom I will draw firsthand examples is the Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford. This is another frontispiece image of the Reverend Stanford, circa 1903. Reverend Stanford was born in enslavement in Hampton, Virginia. He found his way as a young adult to England, like William and Ellen Craft, who also escaped from Macon, Georgia, to Boston and then to England. And his claim to fame was that he became the pastor, the first Black pastor of a church in Birmingham, England. And he is remembered there today, Highgate Baptist Church in Birmingham, England, as the first Black pastor in that industrial city. Both of them contributed widely to the abolitionist press during the 19th century and to other mainstream American publications. And they call attention to how, first and foremost, African Americans who were formerly enslaved and who were able to write down, who obtained literacy and were able to write down their stories or dictate their stories, used the American and the British press primarily to tell their stories. We have an abundance of their stories in those kinds of periodical publications. The Freedom's Journal, which was the first Black newspaper published in 1827. The AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church's Christian Recorder, which was established in Philadelphia in 1852 and became the oldest continually running newspaper published by Black people, and in fact is still being published as a magazine today. These African Americans throughout the 19th and into the early 20th century published in The Liberator, which is arguably the most well-known of the anti-slavery newspapers, beginning in Boston in 1831, edited by the firebrand abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, at the height of its popularity, selling 3,000 copies a week. That's more than the entire Black population of the city of Boston in the mid-19th century. That is how popular The Liberator was as an anti-slavery newspaper. Black newspapers continued well after the American Civil War into the Reconstruction, with the great Indianapolis Freeman. That was the first illustrated Black newspaper in the United States. The great New York Age, published by the African-American activist Timothy Thomas Fortune, and which became one of the widest circulating national Black newspapers of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And not to leave the women out, African American women participated in leadership roles as editors and publishers of periodicals. Most notably, during the late 19th century, we have The Women's Era, which was edited by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin from 1890 through 1897, and was an organ for the circulation of ideas of African American club women. The Colored American magazine represents another late 19th century periodical, early 20th century periodical as well, in which African American women played a major role. It was the first monthly Black periodical, and it was devoted to religion, music, science, literature, and art. So there has been a robust tradition of African Americans, particularly African Americans who had histories of enslavement, gravitating to African American newspapers and later African American magazines in order to tell their stories. I also want, by way of context, to call attention to the fact that African Americans in these periodicals, in these magazines, were not only talking about American history, American culture, what was happening in America during enslavement, but they also were reaching out to their colleagues in the African diaspora in the Caribbean, to their colleagues in the African diaspora in Europe and in the British Isles. They were copying articles from newspapers in those places about Africans who had been kidnapped through the transatlantic slave trade and who created communities in the Caribbean, in the British Isles, and Canada. So there was a dynamic, collaborative tone to these publications. And finally, before I launch into my discussion of specific examples, I want to call attention to how individual stories of individuals like Ellen Craft and her husband William, like Reverend Peter Stanford, were not just stories of their own agency, resilience, and tenacity. Through telling their own stories, they very intentionally and self-consciously were telling stories of their people. They were revising stereotypes of their people. They were reforming dehumanizing notions about African Americans. I'd like you to hold on to that because in the examples to come, I'm going to talk about how these two people in particular emphasize education, wealth building, political activism, not merely to call attention to their own accomplishments after slavery, but also to model to other African Americans and to people in struggle who were not African Americans how to succeed, how they could become productive citizens wherever in the world they were. So could you advance, please? All right, so in this particular slide, I have an image of an article from another important anti-slavery newspaper from the 19th century. This was the National Anti-Slavery Standard. It's not as well known to those of us thinking about Black history today as the Liberator, but it was just as well known during its day. The National Anti-Slavery Standard was published out of Philadelphia in the mid-19th century, but it also circulated widely in New York. And one of its editors may be a name that you're familiar with, Lydia Maria Child, who was a well-known white children's writer and writer of domestic books, and whose name still circulates today in relationship to an African American who was formerly enslaved named Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs escaped slavery in North Carolina in the mid-19th century. She published a book about her experiences called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And Lydia Maria Child, who had edited the National Anti-Slavery Standard, edited Harriet Jacobs' Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl. So that just calls attention to how interconnected white abolitionists and Black abolitionists, white abolitionists and formerly enslaved people were through African American newspapers. This particular article focuses on William and Ellen Craft. I told you that the Crafts had escaped slavery in 1848. They settled in Boston. Thank you, Joy Ellen, in 1849. But by 1851, they had escaped to England because they realized they could not really be safe in the United States because their former enslaver had sent slave catchers up to New England to find them. So they were spirited away first to Canada and then to Liverpool and London by white abolitionists, and then British abolitionist allies supported them. This is published in 1852. This article was published not only in the Anti-Slavery Standard, but in the Liberator and other American newspapers by way of a British newspaper, the Anti-Slavery Advocate, that had first published it. And I just want to read a little bit of this article to call attention to how it's constructing the life of Ellen and her husband William after enslavement, and also through their own individual lives, telling a communal story about African Americans and their potential to be productive citizens. Arrangements have been considerably made so that Mr. and Mrs. Craft receive their lessons in the way most agreeable to their feelings. They are now able to study and reflect upon the contents of that sacred record, which for the greater portion of their lives, the American slaveholder rendered to them a sealed book. So this article is reporting on how now in freedom they're able to study the Bible, and it implies that they are able to study the Bible because they are able to learn to read and write in freedom. They understand that education is key to their success as African Americans in freedom. Note how they are presented as Mr. and Mrs. Craft. They are connected as married people. We could talk for hours about marriage during enslavement and ways in which African Americans were denied the respect accorded to married couples. This is calling attention to how Ellen Craft and her husband, William Craft, are model men and women in that they have come together and they are going to start a family and they are going to have a loving, healthy household. I'm just going to read one more sentence that really underscores, again, this idea of individual stories being told in ways that call attention to a communal idea of African American identity. Second paragraph. Upon their future course, they have not decided. In other words, they don't know what their lives will bring now that they're in exile in England. But their present object, their present goal is the acquisition of such an amount of valuable education as shall qualify them for filling whatever sphere of usefulness Providence may open to them, whether in a retired walk of life or in one more accordant with their wishes. The key word here is usefulness. They are going to be productive citizens wherever they go, and they're going to be productive citizens because they are aspiring to be educated. They will go on almost 10 years later to write their narrative of slavery, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, which was published in England, in London, in 1861, and then very quickly reprinted because of its popularity. And practically every 3 pages, they return in their narrative to the idea of education. First, they're yearning for education in slavery. They're wanting to be able to read and write, and then their actual accomplishment of that in freedom. Next slide, please. William Still was a famous Underground Railroad conductor. He did not publish or edit a newspaper, but he published another very valuable book that has become part of the anti-slavery archive and an important source for accounts of formerly enslaved individuals. William Still was arguably one of the most well-known Black abolitionists of his day, and in his compendious Underground Railroad, a book that's almost 800 pages and more, he talks at length about the story of William and Ellen Craft from slavery. And I call your attention to this because even though their story now appears in a book, what is fascinating about William Still's account is that he cobbles together their story from stories of them in America and in England from the anti-slavery newspapers. Unfortunately, we don't have the time for me to go through this particular paragraph in its entirety, but I do want to call your attention to the fact that it once again amplifies the fact that they have escaped together, that they understand the meaning of being a husband and a wife. They understand the meaning of being Christians, which was very important in their culture as a marker of humanity and citizenship, and that they were very much committed to resisting slavery together. They understood the importance of the collective, of being part of a community that came together to resist enslavement. This particular paragraph very much underscores that idea of community that firsthand accounts of formerly enslaved people underscored, because it tells how after the Civil War, after slavery ended, William and Ellen Craft come back to Georgia. It's a phenomenal story. They come back to the very place where they had been enslaved with a very specific goal. And that goal, this particular paragraph tells us, is to establish a school. They raised money from former anti-slavery friends in Great Britain and the United States, and they purchased several thousand acres outside of what is now the city of Savannah in Bryant County, and they created a school which amazingly served not individuals, but families, and not merely African American families, but the families of white farmers and the families of poor whites around them in that area too. They took that idea of education that had been so integral to their own success in freedom, and they chose to make that really one of the key factors in their entire collective lives as activists. Next slide, please. All right, later in the 19th century, we come upon the story of Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford, who epitomizes the idea of a self-made man. Again, to reiterate, because his story is not as well known as that of other fugitives from slavery like Harriet Jacobs, Frederick Douglass, William Allen Craft. To reiterate, Stanford is born in slavery in Virginia. He finds his way to Connecticut, where he, as a young adult, receives a divinity degree, travels first to Canada to minister among the fugitive slave communities in Toronto West, then makes his way to England, where he writes the first of a series of books about his escape from slavery. If you're interested in the lives, particularly the first-hand accounts of formerly enslaved people, get ready, because many of them tell their stories serially. In other words, they tell their stories over and over again in separately published books or in short accounts within separately published books. We know that Reverend Stanford told the story of his enslavement as a child, his escape from enslavement, and his life after enslavement at least 5 times in separately published books. So by the end of the 19th century, the 1890s, he's come back to the United States. He's become quite the activist in the Boston, Massachusetts area. He's opened up an orphanage, and he becomes really a fixture in the late 19th century African American press, which moves back and moves forward every time there is an opportunity to talk about Reverend Stanford. And by that, I mean, we see how in the late 19th century, African American newspapers were still calling attention to the history of slavery, still making vivid and clear to their readers that African Americans like Reverend Stanford, who had been born in slavery, had become productive citizens, contributing to their communities, contributing to the American nation, being educated. This was a very important goal of the late 19th century and really early 20th century press, like when William Still, the Black abolitionist chronicler, to not give room to African American readers to forget the enormous sacrifices and challenges that slavery had posed to African Americans, not to forget the will that African Americans like Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford had demonstrated in undertaking the dangerous trek from slavery to freedom, almost as a counter to those runaway slave ads that Joy Ellen showed us and did such a rich job of interpreting. We see how in the African American newspapers of the 19th and early 20th century, the stories of the African Americans themselves who had escaped from slavery become a counter to all of those adjectives like sullen and angry and the negative connotations of the word Negro. So this is an example of that from an African American newspaper that was published in the early 20th century called The Colored American by Edward Elder Cooper, an African American man who coincidentally had also helped found one of the most widest circulating Black newspapers of the day, and that was the Indianapolis Freeman. So Cooper had really learned the business. He'd cut his teeth on the Indianapolis Freeman. Remember, I told you that was the first illustrated African American newspaper of the 19th century. He travels to Washington, D.C., and works with communities there to establish this newspaper. And it does a wonderful job of covering the accomplishments of born free, formerly enslaved, and post-Civil War generation African Americans. You can see on the right-hand side of this slide an engraving of the Reverend rather, Peter Thomas Stanford, and an article that really calls attention to the popularity of Peter Thomas Stanford in England, even though he is no longer in England. The article that the Colored American writes calls attention to the fact that a church in England has offered to pay a princely sum to Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford to come back to England from his current post as a preacher in Massachusetts in order to minister again to congregations there. Fortunately for the congregations in Massachusetts, he refused. But I'm going to surprise you, and instead of interpreting the language of that article, what I'm interested in is what's around the article. And I want to call your attention, bringing us back to how do you interpret these texts? I want to call your attention to how important it is when you find interesting articles about formerly enslaved people in anti-slavery newspapers or 19th century African American newspapers. Look at what's around those articles because those can help enhance, complement, add context and texture to the story of the article itself. So here we have a laudatory, complimentary article about Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford. What's around it? How does that add meaning to the article about Stanford? Well, on the right-hand side of the slide, I've copied some of the snippets of events and reports that are around the article about Stanford. And you can see the column is entitled City Paragraphs, and it was a regularly running feature of the Colored American just to cover what was going on in the African American community of Washington, D.C. So along with this relationship that Stanford has connected to in England, we have a note here about a woman named Mrs. Mary Church Terrell, who has delivered a lecture last Sunday evening at Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And then in the next paragraph, we have midway that a man named R.W. Thompson is going to now become the Assistant Private Secretary to Dr. Booker T. Washington. It is a position for which he is eminently fitted and congenial to his tastes. And then the final paragraph there on the left-hand side refers to Howard University, which is well known as one of the premier African-American universities today, one of the premier HBCUs today. And at Howard University, there has been a special memorial service to the late Frederick Douglass under the auspices of the YMCA. The great abolitionist Frederick Douglass had passed away in 1895, incidentally, which is the year that Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford came back to the United States to begin his activist work in and around Massachusetts. So you might wonder, okay, so these are reports of the comings and goings, the doings of other African Americans. So what? What does that have to do with our understanding of the trajectory of formerly enslaved people like Peter Thomas Stanford? Well, Mary Church Terrell becomes one of the most active club women of her day. She is very actively engaged in organizing middle-class African-American women to work for healthier homes and families, and also to agitate for social change, like securing the vote for African-American women. Mary Church Terrell famously would create a pageant about the life of Phyllis Wheatley Peters, one of the earliest African American writers, the famous poet in the 1930s, as a way of calling attention to the contributions of African Americans to literature. Mary Church Terrell worked tirelessly to create a canon of African American literature and theater. Of course, Booker T. Washington is well known as one of the principals of Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, which really set a standard for and a model for the kinds of classes that early African American universities in the 19th century would undertake, and became well known for producing not only African American teachers and preachers, but African American professionals. African American students would go from Tuskegee to the northern schools to gain higher degrees. And of course, the great Frederick Douglass returns us, of course, to the story of slavery. So what's going on here? The Colored Free American is not merely reporting on the comings and goings of African American citizens of the United States. It's placing the stories of formerly enslaved people like Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford and Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist writer. It's placing their stories in a wider context. And that wider context is a community story. I'm just coming full circle to the theme that I started out with. That context is the story not merely of individual accomplishment, but of collective accomplishment. All of these sentences, all of these paragraphs, as you can see, 3 columns worth, add up to a capacious, energetic undertaking by African Americans of the early 20th century, not only to create strong communities, but to demonstrate their value as citizens in a country that was still denying them, particularly in the Deep South, the privileges of citizenship, like the vote, like land ownership. This is a refutation. It is a pushback by virtue of the collective resilience, agency, and tenacity of African Americans. It is a pushback against those stereotypes. Writing against stereotypes was not the only reason that the stories of formerly enslaved people were told in the anti-slavery and African American press. It was an important reason, but it wasn't the only reason. Of course, formerly enslaved African Americans told their stories because they were proud of their individual achievements. They told their story because they wanted to create a legacy to pass down to their children and their children's children, who probably wouldn't be able to believe the conditions that they had experienced. But we can never forget how intentionally African American newspapers were using the stories of formerly enslaved African Americans to make a statement about what was to come. They were Afrofuturists. They were making a statement about the future of African Americans by telling the story of African Americans in the past.
Dr. McCaskill, thank you so much for that rich discussion and for giving us a new perspective on the journeys of 19th century African Americans, particularly those who were enslaved. That was just wonderful. And I have so many thoughts, and I'm sure everyone else watching does too. So I want to thank everyone for watching this program and for attending. This concludes our program. We hope that this webinar was helpful and offered a new way to view, research, and interpret archives of enslavement. Dr. McCaskill and I, as you can see on the slide, have listed our contact information here. Please feel free to reach out to us with questions or any follow-up commentary that you may have. And again, please be sure to find the bibliography that's posted right below this video. You can download it, and it's going to be a great list of resources for further research. Once again, we are so grateful to the Mellon Foundation, to Rare Book School. Thank you to Kennesaw State University and the University of Georgia. So appreciative. And thank you all for watching. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.